They were feared as raiders, branded by fire and sword. But what if the true legacy of the Vikings wasn't destruction, but connection? This isn't the story of bloodied axes and burning monasteries. It's the story of coins buried far from home, of silks found in frozen graves, of a shadow empire stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland. The Vikings didn't just conquer by force, they conquered by trade. Welcome to the hidden network, the untold foundation of the Viking world, beneath the roar of longships and the clash of iron. Something remarkable unfolded, a web of trade so vast, so far-reaching, it silently reshaped the economic geography of Europe without ever needing a king, a coin, or a capital. And it wasn't planned. There were no maps, no central authority. It began with opportunity and grew through daring. Viking merchants ventured out from the cold harbors of Scandinavia, not just with weapons, but with furs, amber, honey, and dreams of distant treasures. Their ships, designed for both sea and river, became the arteries of a system that spanned half the known world from the icy fjords. Their sails reached the warm markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. They traced rivers deep into Slavic forests, built cities on foreign coasts, and whispered deals in languages they didn't even speak. They didn't need to speak. They had silver. Archaeological discoveries shattered old assumptions. Viking trade wasn't small or sporadic, it was enormous. From the shores of Newfoundland to the heart of Baghdad, the Norse footprint appeared in unexpected places. Islamic silver coins unearthed in Sweden. Byzantine silk laid into the graves of Norse women. Glassware from the Rhine sparkling in Scandinavian households. This wasn't the loot of conquest, it was the currency of exchange. But what made it work? The secret lay not in brute force, but in adaptation. The Vikings built a world without borders. They needed no shared currency. Instead, they invented a system of value by weight. Silver, not minted by any king, was cut, weighed, and exchanged with precision. Merchants carried tiny scales in their pouches. Rings of silver were worn not just for decoration, but as portable currency, standardized in weight for instant trade. And when needed, they'd hack off a chunk, a system known as hack silver, to make precise transactions. Every scale, every ingot, every hacked fragment, a quiet rebellion against the centralized economies of Europe. It allowed the Norse to trade across cultures, religions, and political boundaries with nothing more than metal and trust. And trust was essential, because these merchants were not operating within familiar territory. They were crossing linguistic barriers with Slavs, Celts, Arabs, and Byzantines. So they developed trade languages, simple, functional dialects made for business. They didn't argue over contracts or legal systems. They bartered in goods, weighed in silver, and let material value do the talking. A bolt of silk here, a barrel of honey there. 10. An unspoken understanding that this system worked because everyone, no matter their god or king, valued the same thing, wealth. But trade wasn't just survival. It was transformation, the goods flowing through these Viking networks didn't merely fund further ventures, they changed Norse society. Suddenly, the elites of Scandinavia, once defined by their strength in battle, now defined themselves through exotic goods, silks from Byzantium, spices from the East, glassware from Arabia, even perfumes and wine. These weren't accidental acquisitions from raids. They were deliberate consumer choices made by a people who now understood aesthetic, status, and display, not just power. And in return, the Norse had treasures to offer. Furs, especially. Sable, marten, fox. Beaver pelts from the Arctic and subarctic fetched astronomical prices in Mediterranean and Islamic markets. They also traded amber, the fossilized resin from the Baltic, considered not just beautiful, but medicinal and mystical in southern markets. Walrus ivory became a prized replacement for the vanishing elephant ivory. Its creamy texture perfect for carving. And yes, there was one other export. Slaves. It was the darkest pillar of this hidden network. Raids provided them. Markets like Dublin sold them. And Viking ships delivered them to Islamic buyers, Byzantine courts, and wherever labor held a price. The Vikings didn't invent slavery, but they industrialized its transport in the north. So what held this invisible empire together? Not law, not loyalty, not even language. It was built on need, mobility, and a rare genius for pragmatism. The Norse didn't try to conquer the world. They adapted to it. If a river blocked them, they carried their boats across the land. A culture confused them. They bartered in silence. If a coin was useless, they melted it down and weighed it. And somehow, from this scattered system of exchanges, a web formed. A web that stretched from the Volga River to Vinland, from Hidibi to Constantinople, from the deserts of the Caliphate to the frosted forests of Sweden. And here lies the great twist. This web had no name, no emperor, no capital, no single voice. Yet it changed the face of Northern Europe. Cities, it elevated kings. It laid the groundwork for the Christianization and centralization that would follow, without lifting a sword. Only a scale. The Norse were not just warriors. They were builders of invisible empires. And this This was just the beginning. Asterisk. They were clothed in silk, drank wine from glass, wore silver around their arms, and lived in frozen lands where such things were never made. How did the Vikings, children of fjords and fire, come to possess luxuries that even kings of Europe coveted? The answer isn't in their raids, it's in their reach. This is the story of how the Norse turned furs into gold, and gold into power in the popular imagination. The Viking Age is stained with blood, villages burned, monasteries looted, and swords raised toward the sky. But beneath the violence, a quieter revolution was taking place, one that changed the Norse world not through conquest, but through consumption. And it all began with desire. Not desire for land, but for luxury. The Norse elite, once known only for their martial prowess, began to redefine status. The new battlefield was no longer a foreign coast, but the banquet hall, and in that hall, what you wore, what you served your guests, and what your household displayed mattered more than the number of men you could call to arms. Silk was the most coveted, a material so rare in the north that its very presence suggested otherworldly wealth. But it wasn't just a decorative flourish. It was a symbol, a status marker that you had access to trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Beyond the steppe, beyond Byzantium, all the way to the Islamic caliphates. How did this silk get there? Not through a single journey, but through a chain of traders, deals, and handoffs. From the markets of Baghdad to the ships of the Rus, from Slavic ports to Scandinavian graves, archaeological evidence reveals silk fragments carefully woven into the clothing of Norse nobles, preserved in the soil of burial mounds like hidden messages from a global economy. But silk was only the beginning. Spices, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper made their way northward too. These weren't used for preservation. No, they were used for flavor. That means something important. The Norse were choosing to enjoy. They didn't just eat to survive. They were developing a taste for the exotic, altering their food, their habits, and even their senses to accommodate luxury. And what about glass? Not the crude, cloudy vessels known in early Northern Europe, but elegant, transparent glass from Rhenish and Arabic production centers. Bottles, beads, flasks brought north in caravans and ships. Their translucent gleam a marvel to people who had never seen their reflection in a liquid container. The households of Norse elites sparkled in candlelight, their tables adorned, not with stolen goods, but purchased splendor. Then came silver, the true currency of the Viking elite. From the Islamic world flowed wave after wave of silver coins. Diners struck in distant cities like Samarkand and Baghdad eventually melted down, cut, and reshaped into jewelry unlike anything seen before. And this wasn't just economic. It was artistic. The Norse smiths took this foreign silver and blended it with local design, creating pieces that fused East and North into an entirely new visual language. Bracelets that gleamed with both power and portability. Rings that held their value in weight and prestige. Necklaces designed to impress friends and intimidate rivals. This was the creation of a hybrid identity, not entirely Viking, not entirely foreign, but something transcendent of both. Archaeologists have found countless examples of these. Luxury goods in Viking burial sites, clear evidence that what mattered most was not just having the item, but being seen with it, even in death. This wasn't hoarding. This was display. Luxury had become political. If you were a chieftain who wore silk from Byzantium and poured wine into a glass goblet from the Rhine, you were not just wealthy, you were connected. And in the Viking world, connections meant power. But let's flip the lens. What did the Norse export in return for this opulence? What made southern markets hungry for trade with the men of the north? The answer lies in the cold. The northern forests, the snow-covered tundra, the places where few dared to live, were full of what others lacked. Fur, fox, marten, sable, beaver. These animals were rare or entirely unavailable in the south, and their pelts, warm, soft, exotic, became luxury fashion for the elite in Baghdad, Constantinople, and Cordoba in southern Europe and the Islamic world. These furs became status symbols. Kings and caliphs draped themselves in northern winter. And in return, Viking merchants walked away with silver by the sack. Next was amber, not just pretty, but believed to be magical, formed from ancient pine, resin, and washing ashore along the Baltic coasts. Amber was easy for the Norse to access and incredibly difficult to get elsewhere. In the south, it was said to cure disease, protect from evil, and serve as medicine, amulet, or ornament. To hold a bead of amber was to hold a piece of the ancient world, and through Viking trade, that power changed hands again and again, from Scandinavian beaches to Mediterranean temples. But the most controversial Viking export is ivory. Not from elephants, those were hunted to near extinction, but from walruses in the far north. The Vikings found a replacement for the elephant. Tusk, the curved, ivory-rich tooth of the walrus. Its rarity and unusual texture made it a prized material for carvings, religious objects, and ornamental works. Monks in France used it to carve crosses, Muslim artisans shaped it into intricate boxes. Vikings harvested it and sold it. And finally, there was flesh, human flesh. The Vikings didn't just take slaves during raids. They traded them, captured during warfare, or bought from slavers. These individuals were transported along Viking routes, sometimes as far as North Africa or the Abbasid Empire. Dublin, Hidibi, and other centers developed into robust slave markets, and, unlike the Vikings themselves, the victims of this trade never returned home. It was a moral stain, but a lucrative one. And for the Viking merchant warrior, profit often outweighed conscience. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the Vikings were not barbarians playing at commerce. They were shrewd, adaptive, and sophisticated. They knew what others wanted. They built systems to deliver it. And they used the wealth they earned not just to live, but to transform. They changed their diets, their clothing, their jewelry, their architecture, even their art and burial customs. The Viking world was turning quietly, steadily, from the inside out, and at the center of it all was power born from trade. This was not the age of raids. This was the age of relationships, of fur for spice, of fur for spice, of ivory for glass, of gold for loyalty. It was the silent revolution of the North, one that didn't begin with fire, but with fur. Asterisk. We've seen the silk. We've smelled the spice. We've watched silver flow northward into Viking lands. But now, the darker chamber of the Norse economy, because not all that glitters is earned without blood. This is the story of ivory pulled from beasts of the Arctic, of silver shattered and weighed in secret, and of people taken, chained, and sold like coin that. Welcome to the hidden machinery of the Viking world. A machine powered not just by trade, but by human lives. We begin far from the meadows and harbors of Denmark to understand this part of the Norse commercial empire. We must sail north into the icy seas, beyond the Arctic Circle, where walruses roam in the fog and the air bites like steel. Here, Viking hunters found something the rest of the world craved: ivory, not from elephants, but from the massive, curved tusks of the walrus. When elephant ivory became scarce in Africa, the Norse stepped in. Their brutal hunts brought back this glacial gold, and soon, walrus ivory was appearing in the markets of Paris, Constantinople, and Cairo. It was smoother than bone, carvable, durable. Exotic European monks shaped it into crucifixes and chess pieces. Muslim artisans carved it into jewelry boxes and Quran cases. and the source of it all. A Viking sailor, frostbitten, silent, holding the tusks like treasure. But that was just the beginning. While Ivory impressed, it was silver that kept the engine turning. Not coin, not currency, weight. Unlike the kingdoms of Christendom or the Caliphate, the Norse operated without a state-minted currency. They didn't need permission to trade. They didn't wait for royal seals. They carried scales in their pouches and hacked silver into pieces with their blades. This was hack silver, a brutal, efficient solution. You wanted to buy? Fine. Let's weigh it. No face of a king. Number. Border. Just metal. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of these fragments across the Viking world. Coins melted down. Arm rings cut in half. Silver chains broken into bits, all to make precise, fractional payments. Some rings were made with standardized weight, doubling as fashion and money. Others were deliberately smashed into bits, revealing the raw heart of a weight-based system where every ounce counted. A merchant's most important tools. Not a sword, not even a map, but a balanced scale and knowledge of silver's shimmer. This system allowed the Vikings to trade anywhere from Slavic markets to Arab ports with no centralized mint, no imperial permission, no holy empire behind them, just silver. Silver became the Viking passport, and they carried it to places you never imagined. But where did this silver come from? Some of it was earned, some taken, but much of it was purchased through a terrible transaction. Because one of the Viking world's most lucrative exports is people, slaves, human beings. It didn't start as a system. It started with raids, monasteries sacked, villages burned, survivors captured, women, children, anyone who could be marched, tied, and sold. But over time, devolved. It became organized. Centers like Dublin emerged, not only as raiding bases, but as full-fledged slave markets. York and Novgorod joined the web. There, human cargo was bought and sold like barrels of honey or stacks of fur. Arabic sources. Men like Ibn Fadlan described the Norse slave trade in chilling detail. They saw Rus merchants, Scandinavian men, armed and silent, traveling down the Volga with men and women in chains. Slaves were stripped naked, displayed like animals, and sold to Islamic buyers in Khazar, Baghdad, and beyond. Europe was no exception. Christian buyers and sellers trafficked through Norse routes. The economy made no distinction between faiths. When it came to profit, men became labor, women, concubines, children, clean slates for servitude, and the silver poured back. This wasn't a side operation. It was a pillar of Norse commerce. And the evidence is clear. Dublin's rise coincides with its slave trading boom. Graves of Norse elites contain wealth far beyond what raiding alone could explain. Hacked silver hoards appear near known slave trade nodes, confirmation that transactions were weighed, paid, and buried. This economy of silver rings and chained flesh financed more than just commerce. It built cities. It funded shipyards. It paid for silk dot. And, paradoxically, it elevated a civilization because, as dark as this trade was, it made the Norse powerful. But there's a deeper layer still, because the Vikings didn't just trade with others. They changed because of that trade. Foreign coins came in and disappeared. They were melted, transformed. Even the language shifted. Arabic terms crept into Norse vocabulary for weights, spices, cloth, and currency. A silver ring from Baghdad might now hang on a chieftain's wrist in Trondheim. A slave taken from the Slavic forests might end her days in an Andalusian palace. An arm ring hacked in York might one day pay for cinnamon in Constantinople. The system had no flag, but it had rules, and the Norse mastered them. So where does this leave us? With a truth far more complex than the myth of the axe-wielding Viking. Yes, they fought. Yes, they burned. But they also measured. They bought. They sowed. And in the gaps between violins, in the market stalls, on the riverbanks, inside shadowy trade halls, they forged an empire of wealth, not with kings, but with scales. This is not a clean history. It's not noble. It's not pure, but it is real. A world where silver rings bore blood, where ivory came at a tusk's price, where gold clinked beside chains. This was the Viking Age, not just a time of conquest, but of calculation, not just the clang of swords, but the quiet chime of silver falling onto the scale. Imagine a world where money had no face, no king, no queen, no promise stamped by royal decree. Now imagine that world stretching across continents, trading silk, furs, spices, and silver without a single coin ever needing a ruler's name. This world existed, and the Vikings didn't just live in it, they built it. This is the story of a commerce run on weight, not allegiance. A system older than banks, smarter than borders, and utterly without precedent in Europe. This is the empire of the unmarked. Scale. Let's start with a mystery unearthed by time. Archaeologists across northern Europe, in Sweden, Norway, Ireland, even England, began finding buried hoards of silver, thousands of coins, rings, and chains. But something was strange. The coins were from everywhere. Abbasid dinars from Baghdad, Anglo-Saxon pennies from Mercia, Carolingian silver from the Frankish world. And yet, they weren't used as coins. They were cut, melted, smashed into fragments. Some were bent, others deliberately broken. And in the same hoards, buried alongside the coins, were tiny bronze scales and sets of lead weights. This was not a monetary system. This was something else to the Vikings. Silver was not about currency. It was about weight. Value wasn't in the king's face on a coin. It was in the metal itself. In Viking markets, you could pay with anything: a bracelet, a coin, a goblet, as long as it weighed the right amount. And that was the genius, because it meant a Viking merchant could trade across all borders. He didn't care if your coin was Frankish, Islamic, or Byzantine. He'd drop it on his scale and say yes or no. This system created the most flexible commercial network in Europe. It worked in Iceland, in Kiev, in Hiddeby, and in Dublin. No unified state, no central mint, no trust in distant kings, only trust in the silver and the scale. The tools of the trade were simple and universal. A balanced scale, small enough to hang from your belt. A collection of standardized weights, often made from lead, shaped into cubes or discs. And, most importantly, silver in whatever form you could carry. Coins, cut rings, bars, beads, even chunks of hacksilver, shards of melted down treasure. These weren't peasants improvising in chaos. This was a deliberate system, consistent, logical, and trusted from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In fact, so standard were these Viking measures that identical weights had been found in hoards scattered across vast distances from Norway to Russia, implying a shared understanding, a sort of unspoken code of trade. And it wasn't just individuals carrying scales. Merchants, settlement leaders, even Viking warriors, often buried with their weapons, were also buried with their silver and their weights. To own a balanced scale wasn't just about trade. It was about power. Even the Viking arm rings served dual purposes. Yes, they were beautiful. Yes, they were worn as symbols of status, but they were also money. Their weight was often standardized to convenient units, so you could slice off a chunk if you needed to pay. They were currency on the body, walking wealth. A wearable bank, a wearable bank. A Viking chieftain might arrive in a foreign port with no coin, no language, no allies, but his silver ring and the merchant's scale would speak for him. This system thrived precisely because the Vikings had no centralized empire. They couldn't impose a royal coin across their scattered domains. So they turned that weakness into strength by refusing to tie their trade to any single currency. They made their economy fluid. Like the rivers and seas, they sailed, and it worked. From the muddy marketplaces of Dublin to the dazzling bazaars of Samarkand, Vikings paid and got paid in silver by weight. And we know this not just from coins, but from hoards, so many hoards. The Shardlow hoard in England, over 8,500 silver items, coins from Islamic caliphates, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, hacked rings, all mixed together by weight. The Vale of York hoard, buried treasure from a Norse leader, including coins from Afghanistan, Ireland, and everywhere in between. Smaller hoards across the Baltic, Russia, and Scandinavia show the same pattern. No political allegiance, no national currency, just silver, and trust in the scale. In a world fractured by religion, language, and war, the Viking merchant found a way to cut through it all. He didn't care if you prayed to Christ or Allah. He didn't need your dialect. He didn't even need your coin to have a name. He only needed the sound of silver hitting his scale. And if the weight was right, the deal was done. So, what did this create? Not an empire of borders, but an empire of exchange. A silent, silver-fed network held together not by flags, but by shared standards, forged from need and precision. And maybe that's the most astonishing part of all. The Vikings, feared as destroyers, were actually building something remarkable, not with stone and steel, but with economics. They stitched together Baghdad and York, Novgorod and Reykjavik, not through conquest, but through commerce, and they did it without a coin ever needing a king. We like to think of civilization as resting on institutions, governments, armies, currencies. But the Viking world teaches us something different, that trust, value, and connection can be built with no ruler, no throne, and no borders, just silver and a scale. They came not only by sea, but by river, long ships slicing into the continent like blades, through forests, across plains, past burning skies and frozen marshes. No compass, no maps, no maps, no mercy. This wasn't a raid. It was a journey of discovery, commerce, and domination, far from the coasts of Scandinavia. This was the Viking Passage, east to the mysterious cities of the Rus, to the river routes that led to Baghdad, and into the heart of empires they would never fully understand, but would shape forever. Welcome to the rivers of fire. The Norse had conquered the sea, but now they turned inland toward the vast river networks that crisscrossed Eastern Europe and connected the north to the golden cities of the east. Their vessels, the shallow draft longships, weren't just sea monsters. They were river beasts, built to glide over sandbars, push up against currents, and even be dragged across land when the rivers failed. And so they did. They followed the Dvina, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, and the mighty Volga. They charted ancient trade paths between the Baltic Sea and the Caspian, the Black Sea and beyond. This was not legend. This was the Varangian route, a real beating artery of Viking commerce that reached all the way from Sweden to Persia. Who were these river-faring Vikings? To the Arabs, they were known as the Rus. To the Byzantines, the Varangians. To the Slavs, sometimes saviors, sometimes slavers, but to themselves, they were Norsemen, sailors, traders, warriors, diplomats, and above all, navigators of a world few in the West even knew existed. The journey was brutal. The rivers were long, infested with rapids, brigands, and disease. The Dnieper alone had more than 7 deadly rapids, each with names whispered like curses. Rapids where longships had to be carried over land by men already starving and surrounded by danger, yet still they came, because the rewards were beyond imagination. The Viking eastbound trade was a pipeline of wealth. From the north flowed furs, amber slaves, wax honey. From the south came silk, spices, coins, glassware, weapons, wine, and from the Muslim Caliphate, perhaps the most valuable of all, silver, Arabic coins, dinars, struck in cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Tabaristan, were found by the thousands in Viking burials and hoards, not by accident, not as plunder, but as payment for goods, services, protection, and sometimes people. The Norse weren't just traders. They were intermediaries, the muscle and engine of a massive transcontinental economy. And they weren't just passing through. They built cities on these riverbanks. They established settlements that grew into trade centers, and later, full-fledged states. Novgorod, a powerful river town with Norse roots. Stare Ladoga, often called the first capital of Russia. And above all, Kiev. These weren't raiding outposts. They were commercial hubs, armed with walls, markets, and multilingual populations. From these points, Viking lords, known as the Rus, ruled over Slavs, Finns, and Balts alike. They collected tribute, levied taxes, enforced trade laws, and sent embassies to Constantinople and Baghdad. They were becoming something new. Not just merchants, not just raiders, but princes. But this evolution didn't mean they lost their edge. Arabic eyewitnesses like Ibn Fadlan tell us what they saw. Tall men, blonde, and covered in tattoos, armed to the teeth, trading in fine goods, while burning incense over their dead slaves. The Rus were terrifying and refined, brutal and ritualistic. One moment, they'd offer honey and fox pelts. The next, they'd offer a captured slave. The Byzantines took note. The Eastern Roman Empire, constantly beset by internal strife and external threats, began to see the Vikings not as enemies, but as allies, fierce, loyal, fearless. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine military composed entirely of Norsemen and Rus warriors. They protected emperors, fought in palace coups, and earned riches that would find their way back to the snowy streets of Uppsala and Hedeby. Imagine that, a Norse warrior born in a Scandinavian fishing village, now guarding the gates of Constantinople, the richest city on earth. The rivers had done something the seas could not. They had turned the Vikings from outsiders into insiders, not just raiders skimming the coastlines, but power players in the east. They now negotiated with caliphs. They spoke before emperors. They held cities. They levied tax. They were still Norse, but they had learned to rule. And through all of it, one thing remained constant. The river, it carried goods, it carried men, it carried culture, and it carried transformation, because the Viking who started his journey with a boat and a bag of pelts often ended it with a silk robe, a gold dinar, and the taste of saffron still lingering on his tongue. He wasn't just a merchant now. He was something else, part Norse, part Slavic, part Eastern, a hybrid forged by water and want. This is the story not found in textbooks or sagas. This is the Viking you never knew. Not just the breaker of monasteries, but the builder of cities. Not just the reaver of shores, but the ruler of rivers. Not just a barbarian from the cold, but a bridge between worlds that never should have met, and yet collided on the current. They arrived as strangers, foreigners with no land, no language, and no claim. Just long ships, silver, and the will to shape the world. And somehow, they didn't just pass through. They stayed. They ruled. They built nations. This is not the story of raids. It's the story of foundations, of Viking rulers in Slavic lands, of cities born on trade and hardened by steel, and of a legacy that still echoes through the heart of modern Eastern Europe. This is the tale of Kiev, Novgorod, and the empire the Vikings left behind when the Norse began to push eastward along the great rivers. They weren't planting flags or claiming thrones. They were searching for silver, for fur, for access to the booming markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. But what they found instead was opportunity, and what began as temporary trading stations soon became something more. Let's begin with Novgorod, the new town. In the 9th century, it was nothing more than a cluster of outposts along the Volkhov River. But the Norse saw what others didn't. A gateway to the north, the Baltic Sea. To the south, the Dnieper and Volga trade arteries. To the east, the deep Slavic forests brimming with fir, wax, and timber. The Norse settled in, built docks, traded with Slavic tribes, and defended their station with sword and silver. Over time, Novgorod grew from a waypoint into a marketplace, from a marketplace into a city, and from a city into a state. The Norse called themselves the Rus, and in Novgorod, the Rus began to rule. But they didn't erase the locals. They fused. Slavic, Norse, and Finnic cultures collided and interwove. Pagan gods blended into one another. Languages fused into a hybrid dialect. Local chiefs became allies or vassals. Rus leaders began marrying local women. A new elite emerged, neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Slavic, an identity born of trade, diplomacy, and steel. And from this fusion came expansion. The Rus moved south, and there, on the banks of the Dnieper, they founded the city that would one day become the heart of an empire. Kiev. Kiev wasn't just a trade post. It was a strategic masterpiece. It lay at the crossroads of the river trade, too. Byzantium and the overland routes toward the Caspian and the steppe. From Kiev, a Norse prince could tax every merchant ship traveling south. He could extract tribute from local Slavic tribes, and he could launch diplomatic missions to both Constantinople and Baghdad, which is exactly what they did by the early 10th century. Kievan Rus had emerged as a real power, a networked kingdom bound not by culture or religion, but by commerce and control. And at its head were Viking rulers of Novgorod, who captured Kiev and made it his capital. Igor, who continued his campaigns, consolidating control over the trade routes. Olga, his wife, a fearsome regent and one of the first rulers of Rus to embrace Christianity. And finally, Sviatoslav, a warrior prince who led his armies into the Balkans and fought both Byzantines and Bulgars with equal ferocity. These were no longer merchants or explorers. They were dynasts, kings, founders. But the brilliance of Kievan Rus wasn't just in conquest. It was in structure. The Rus state was decentralized, yet effective. It operated more like a federation of trading cities, each ruled by a prince, connected by kinship, commerce, and roads. Silva flowed through the arteries of this new kingdom. Islamic dinars, Byzantine coins, Norse hacksilver, They taxed it, hoarded it, and spent it. And with that silver, they built cathedrals, fortresses, roads, markets, and networks of influence that stretched far beyond their borders. And they didn't just look west. The Rus maintained deep ties with the East. Arabic historians like Ibn Fadlan and al-Masudi wrote detailed accounts of the Rus, their ships, their rituals, their brutal burials, and their complex trade relationships. They saw Norsemen sailing south with furs and slaves, and returning north with coins, silk, and exotic goods to the Islamic world. The Rus were feared, respected, and vital. They were the northern gatekeepers of silver. But the Rus didn't stop there. Their rulers understood the power of religion, and they began to flirt with Christianity, not out of faith, but diplomacy. They negotiated with the Byzantines, trading conversion for military, alliance, and marriage ties. Eventually, under Vladimir the Great, Kievan Rus would fully convert to Orthodox Christianity, forever aligning the region with Eastern Europe rather than the Catholic West. But the foundation of that transformation was laid by Vikings men who came for silver and stayed to build nations. Let's pause and take in the scale. From tiny ports in Denmark and Sweden to the sprawling streets of Kiev and Novgorod, the Norse had done what no northern people had ever done. They created a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, transcontinental network of cities and trade routes. They became kings in foreign lands. They built legal systems, economies, and dynasties. And they did it all without ever abandoning their roots. Even as they adopted Slavic names, even as they converted to Christianity, they remembered the rivers, the ships, silver. So when we speak of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, these modern nations, we must speak of the Rus. And when we speak of the Rus, we must remember the Vikings. They were more than raiders, more than pirates. They were founders, builders of cities, shapers of states, and the first to unite the chaotic forests and rivers of the East under a banner of silver and steel. This wasn't just a detour in Viking history. It was a transformation, a bridge between North and East, between pagan gods and Orthodox saints, between fur trading longboats and the birth of nations. And it all began with a ship on a river, carrying men who refused to turn back far from the fjords, past the rivers of silver, beyond the forests of the East. There stood a city like no other, a city of gold domes and marble palaces, of sacred icons and towering cathedrals. A city so rich, so powerful, it made even Viking warriors kneel. Constantinople, that seat of the Byzantine Empire, the last echo of Rome, and, in time, a new kind of battlefield for the Norse. Not one of fire and steel, but of service, loyalty, and prestige. This is the story of how the Vikings didn't just reach the gates of Byzantium. They walked inside and stood at the right hand of emperors. The route to Constantinople was long, from the icy harbors of the Baltic, down the Volkhov through Novgorod, then south along the Dnieper, past rapids and bandits, Slavic tribes and Khazar tolls all the way to the Black Sea, and then through the straits into the greatest city on earth for centuries. Constantinople had been a shimmering dream to northern merchants and warriors, a city where stone streets sparkled, where the markets never closed, and where gold and silk flowed like rivers. But it was more than a destination. It was a turning point, because here, the Norse, once raiders, found their place as defenders. It began with diplomacy. Kievan, Rus, princes, seeking legitimacy and trade privileges, sent envoys to the Byzantine court. Treaties were drawn, gifts exchanged, and, crucially, Norse warriors were invited to serve. The Byzantines had a problem. Their own mercenaries were unreliable, their aristocracy fractured, their generals often too ambitious. But the Norse, they were strong, they were loyal, and they had no political ambitions in the empire, only silver and honor. And so was born the Varangian Guard, a personal bodyguard to the Byzantine emperor himself. Not Greeks, not Romans, but Vikings, men from Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. Later, Anglo-Saxons too, sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, wielding massive axes, standing at court like statues of war. They were elite. They were feared. They were loyal, even when the empire itself, WASN, single quotes, Arab historians and Byzantine chroniclers alike recorded their presence. They called them axe-bearing giants, said they were silent in ceremony, thunderous in battle, said that emperors trusted them more than their own sons, and when palace coups erupted, when emperors were overthrown, assassinated, or blinded, the Varangians remained firm. They didn't care who wore the crown, only that their oaths were kept and their silver paid. But service in Constantinople wasn't just about battle. It was about exposure to culture, to architecture, to religion, to wealth beyond imagination. And when these warriors returned home, those who survived the chaos of the East, they brought back more than coin. They brought stories of golden thrones, of marble halls, of saints and incense and vast choirs echoing in domed cathedrals. And slowly, these stories changed the North. We find evidence of this Byzantine connection buried in the graves of Norse elites. Silk robes imported from Constantinople. Byzantine coins placed on the eyes of the dead. Cross pendants and religious icons worn before conversion officially swept the region. This wasn't the result of missionaries. It was the result of mercenaries, warriors who served in a Christian empire and brought its memory home. But the influence didn't just flow one way. The Norse left their mark on Byzantium. Too, they became models of discipline. They reshaped imperial bodyguard units. They stood in frescoes and were etched into marble dot, and some, it is said, rose to incredible heights. One Norseman, Harald Hardrada, served as a Varangian in the 1030s. He led campaigns into Syria and Bulgaria. He fought pirates, collected immense wealth. When he returned to the north, he became king of Norway. Imagine that. A man who once guarded the gates of Constantinople, returning home to rule a kingdom forged in fire. The Varangian legacy is a quiet one, not found in sagas of dragon ships and shield walls. But it is no less real. It was a legacy of professionalism, of cultural exchange, of adaptation, proof that the Vikings were not just destroyers, but diplomats, soldiers, and survivors who knew when to put down the axe and pick up the coin. And perhaps most telling is this: in the Byzantine palace of Constantinople, the Varangians carved their names in Norse runes into the marble of the Hagia Sophia. Those runes still exist, simple inscriptions, scratched by men far from home, now embedded in one of the holiest buildings in Christendom. A whisper from the north, preserved in stone. So the next time someone tells you the Vikings vanished, that their age ended with blood and defeat, tell them of Constantinople. Tell them of the silent warriors in golden halls, of silver earned by loyalty, not loot. Tell them that in the shadow of Byzantium, the Norse learned to serve, and through that service, they conquered without conquest. We remember them for fire, for terror, for the longships that carved their names into the shores of Europe. But there is a truth that history whispers, and few ever hear. The Vikings didn't just destroy cities. They built them. Ports, markets, craft centers, streets. They laid foundations, not just in stone, but in culture. And though the sagas sing of raids and revenge, the silent legacy of the Norse is not in blood, it's in brick. This is the story of the Viking urban revolution, of towns born in the mudflats of Scandinavia, of foreign capitals where Norse tongues echoed, of a civilization that built, traded, governed long before medieval Europe even knew what a city was. Welcome to the age of the city builders. It began with necessity, as Viking trade expanded, as goods flowed from east to west. From Baghdad to Dublin, the Norse needed more than harbors. They needed hubs, places where merchants could gather, where silver could be weighed, where craftsmen, warriors, and traders could live side by side. So they began to build. One of the earliest was Hiddeby, in present-day Germany, nestled along a navigable fjord. Near the Jutland Peninsula, Hiddeby became a nerve center. It had everything: a harbor, defensive walls, craftsmen's quarters, street grids, marketplaces, a mint for striking coins. Even before the Christian monarchies took hold by the 9th century, Hiddeby was bustling. Merchants from across Europe, the East, and the Islamic world passed through, and Viking ships came and went by the hundreds. This was not a village. It was an engine of commerce and culture. Then there was Birka on Lake Mälaren in Sweden. It, too, was planned with areas for metalworking, textile production, and long-distance trade. Archaeologists have uncovered workshops, warehouses, and docks, as well as graves rich in imported goods. Birka wasn't just a trade post. It was a cosmopolitan town where Norse traders rubbed shoulders with Slavs, Franks, and possibly even Islamic travelers. Its very existence proved the lie. In the stereotype, the Norse weren't isolated. They were connected, and they made those connections permanent. Further west, Dublin tells another story. Founded by Viking settlers in 841 CE. It began as a long fort, a fortified naval base for raiding, but it quickly evolved. Dublin became a capital, a center for slave trading, for coin minting, for imported luxury goods. Glassware from the Rhineland, coins from North Africa, amber, furs, wool, and walrus ivory all passed through its ports, and over time, Dublin grew. By the 10th century, it was one of the largest towns in the British Isles, rivaling cities in Anglo-Saxon England and surpassing native Irish settlements. In population and complexity, the Norse had turned a raiders' camp into a metropolis, and the transformation didn't end there. In York, or JRVK, in northern England, Viking rulers inherited a Roman city and made it Norse. They reopened trade with the continent, minted their own coins, developed crafts from bone carving to glass blowing. York, under the Vikings, was a city of artisans and international trade. At its heart were markets and workshops. Outside its walls, farms, longhouses, and road systems tied to wider Anglo-Scandinavian trade networks. JRVK was not a pirate base. It was an urban capital. What makes these cities remarkable is not just their scale, but their sophistication. They were planned, not random clusters of huts, but gridded streets, zoning for artisans, dedicated trade quarters, and defensive structures. This wasn't typical for early medieval Europe. In many parts of the continent, Roman cities had fallen into ruin. Trade had collapsed. Urban life was the exception, not the norm. But in the Viking world, the opposite was happening. Urbanism was spreading, and with these cities came administration. The Norse established legal codes, tax systems, and market regulations. They minted coins, yes, real currency, in towns like York, Dublin, and even Lund. Coins bearing Norse names, or at least Norse rulers borrowing Christian imagery to legitimize their power. They collected tolls, organized militias, maintained order in a time when many European kings could barely control their countryside. Viking towns were thriving experiments in governance. So what were these cities really? They were a crossroads between pagan and Christian, between northern and southern Europe, between the Atlantic and the Baltic, between barbarian and imperial legacies. They were places where a merchant from Baghdad might drink wine with a Norse chieftain, where a Slavic fur trader haggled beside an Irish metalworker, where Latin, Arabic, Old Norse, and Slavic dialects danced in the same streets. And as they grew, so too did the Viking identity. No longer just sea kings or warlords. The Norse became administrators, planners, diplomats. They sent envoys, negotiated treaties, raised stone churches next to pagan burial mounds, and turned mudflats into monuments. This was the final, quiet revolution of the Viking Age. Not a war, not a raid, but a city. By the time Christian monarchies fully took root in Scandinavia, by the time kings like Olaf and Harald converted and centralized, the foundation had already been laid. The cities were there, the trade networks humming, the institutions waiting. The Norse had already built the skeleton of the medieval North, not with crosses or cathedrals, but with ports and scales, with taxes and treaties, with walls, workshops, and urban dreams. So, the next time someone speaks of Vikings as destroyers, show them Hedebe's docks, show them Birka's markets, show them Dublin's coins, show them York's artisans. Tell them the Norse didn't just burn cities, they built them.